Audio Jungle.
Today I'm here with Brad Feld, Managing Director of the Foundry Group and co-founder of TechStars. Brad's really been a voice of transparency and advocacy regarding mental health issues for entrepreneurs. He's written and spoken about his own experiences, and I know he's also been a big listening ear to entrepreneurs since he first started investing in 1987. Brad, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. I'd like to start the interview kind of talking about your general experiences, and then we'll kind of deep dive into the topic of expectations. So you've been investing since 1987, and you're quite a legend in the startup community. For those who are watching who may not be familiar with your story, can you tell us about your struggles with depression over the years?
Sure. So just a quick calibration. I started my first company in 87, which I sold in 1993 to a public company, and that's about when I started investing. So, 20, 21 years now. I have, as an adult, I just turned 50. I've had three major depressive episodes, where I define a depressive episode as real depression and lasting more than a couple of days. I had my first in my mid-20s, and it lasted almost 2 years. I had my second in my mid-30s around 9/11. It lasted 3 months. And then I had one in my mid-40s, beginning of 2013. It lasted about the first 6 months of the year. And they were all different, but they had some similar characteristics. And one of the constants among all three of them were my willingness to be open with increasingly wider audiences about what I was struggling with. So the first time I was depressed in my 20s, I was incredibly ashamed. I felt like it was weakness. I was the CEO of a company that was doing well. And the only person I was comfortable, or only people I was comfortable talking to about it were my girlfriend at the time, Amy, now my wife, and my business partner, Dave. In my mid-30s, I was more open, but still not public, but a broader group of people as I was struggling. And I think a lot of people were struggling after 9/11 with depression in lots of different parts of our society for a wide variety of reasons, not just 9/11, but the crash of the internet bubble, all of the stress, that comes with the environment. But I was still, I would say, that time not ashamed and not concerned that I would never feel better. When I was depressed for 2 years in my 20s, I had many, many days where I felt like if this was the way the rest of my life was going to be, it wasn't going to be very fun.
Right.
In my mid-30s, I was more comfortable with that. And then when I was depressed in my mid-40s, came out of the blue, was a complete surprise to me. And so I was very, very open about what I was going through while I was going through it, about my own struggles with it. So that's kind of the history of it.
Yeah, and so for many entrepreneurs as well as investors, I feel this myself, you really want to kind of overachieve, and it can be easy to kind of commit to too many things, become overworked, and really run down. Do you set any sort of boundaries for yourself, and have you gotten better at doing that to really help
Yeah.
maintain your well-being?
It's a chronic problem for me. It's always been a chronic problem in that part of what I go through. I used to describe as boom and bust cycles of energy, and I go through these incredibly intense periods of time of work, of focus, of emotional energy, of travel, of physical activity, sometimes of physical achievement. I run marathons, and then I'd always crash. And this crash kind of would happen almost on an annual basis. I'd kind of 6, 7, 8 months of that, and I'd, just be exhausted. And when I was in my mid-30s, after the second depression, and also struggling with my relationship with Amy, we'd been together for a decade, and we were very much in love with each other, but she was very tired of my inability to put any kind of constraint on what I was doing. And more importantly, something that I think was more foundational, which is that my words didn't match my actions. So, and this was true across everything. I would say to Amy things like, "You're the most important person in the world to me," and then we'd be at dinner, and the phone would ring, and this was before caller ID. I wouldn't even like think about it. I'd just say, "Hang on a second," in the middle of a conversation, "Hello, Brad Feld," or we'd plan a dinner, and I'd be an hour late, and it didn't reinforce this notion. It was the opposite. It undermined this notion that she was my highest priority. I give that as a very personal example, but I had many of those. Right. And much of it had to do with my own respect for myself. I use, when you turn 50, a lot of people have different, things that they go through in terms of being middle-aged and different phase of life. For a long time, I've been trying to figure out how can I sustain what I do in a way that's interesting to me. And the phrase that my friend Jerry Colonna, who now runs Reboot.io, uses is this notion of radical self-inquiry, constantly exploring what's important to you. And so for me, what I learned a long time ago was that I'm very bad at this abstainer moderator spectrum. I'm a very bad moderator. Yeah. It's much easier for me to abstain. And, there's lots of examples of that, but even alcohol is a good example, an easy example of it, right? I don't drink a lot. I didn't grow up with, my parents didn't drink. I drank in college, plenty of social drinking. It's much harder for me to have one glass of wine versus 2 or 3 than to have 0. It's a lot easier for me just to decide I'm not going to have any wine at dinner tonight and then have nothing versus saying I'm going to have 1 glass and then a second glass happens and a third glass happens and not a 7th glass. Like it doesn't keep going. Yeah. But apply that construct across work. It's hard for me to say no. I like to do everything. I want to be engaged and responsive. I'm interested in all kinds of things. So one of the things I've had to learn personally is where I live on that spectrum. And then how to calibrate my own behavior against what I want as goals. And Amy and I wrote a book together called Startup Life, Surviving and Thriving in a Relationship with an Entrepreneur. So might be a useful book for some people that are paying attention to this.
I bought a copy for my boyfriend.
There you go. We didn't, it's got some autobiographical stuff. And it's not intended to be a relationship book, but it uses our experience to talk about how to interact more effectively, and part of it is learning each other. Right. And as the entrepreneur, being aware that part of your goal, if you want to be an entrepreneur and sustain your behavior over a long period of time as an entrepreneur, sustain your energy to be an entrepreneur, figuring out yourself and what allows you to have sustainable rhythms yourself, as well as in the relationships you're in. First with a significant other, then potentially with family is super important.
Yeah. So that I'm sure you've kind of been tweaking and iterating on what your version of like a successful, healthy, and balanced workday looks for you. What does it look like today?
Well, it changed really dramatically a couple of years ago when I went through this depressive episode. Up until that point, so until I was, from early 20s to late 40s, 5 days a week, I was the guy that always got up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Didn't matter what time zone I was in, I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning. And I had a rhythm from 5 to 9 where I would write, I would read, I would catch up on email, I would exercise. So I had sort of this 4-hour me time, of which when I was home, the first hour and a half or so was completely me because Amy didn't usually get up till the sun got up. So 6 to 7 when she got up, we'd spend a little bit of time together. But my work day didn't really start till 9. And then my work day would generally go from 9 until when it ended. And Monday to Thursday, I almost always had something in the evenings. Oftentimes on Fridays, I would have something in the evenings. I was traveling 75% of the time, so a lot of the time, was on planes moving from point A to point B. And I had this very scheduled life. Everything was in 30-minute chunks or more. I didn't do random phone calls. Everything was scheduled even before that kind of became a thing.
Yeah.
And I got depressed. I spent 6 months in this depressive state, and I changed a bunch of things. One thing I did was I stopped getting up with an alarm clock,
Okay.
and I just woke up when I woke up, and I moved my 9 o'clock start time to 11.
Okay.
And I just said I'll wake up when I wake up, and it was interesting. I slept for the first 6 months. I didn't have a single night where I slept less than 12 hours.
Wow.
So
You
it
were
was
tired.
remarkable
You
to
needed
me
it.
how exhausted I was, cumulatively exhausted over this period of time. Oh, by the way, I didn't talk about my weekends. For many years, I worked both days on the weekends. Then I stopped working, I stopped taking meetings on the weekends, but I still did email. I still wrote. I still worked. I still did phone calls. So my rhythm change was no alarm clock. Don't schedule anything that's a meeting until 1 o'clock. Only have meetings between 1 o'clock and 6. Schedule at least one night a week out with Amy. Take Saturdays off completely. So I started doing this thing called a digital Sabbath, where Friday sundown to usually Sunday morning, but sometimes Saturday night, I didn't get online. I didn't check email. I didn't make phone calls. And then, kind of catch up on Sunday as I felt like it.
Right.
And what I found was once I got over being exhausted, I was waking up earlier and I was having a lot of open time. I started scheduling a lot less stuff. So I stopped scheduling all my phone calls. And I stopped scheduling all of these meetings, and I just sort of let things flow a little bit more. I still had lots of board meetings and lots of things that were scheduled.
Right.
But I opened up more time and space, which has changed my work behavior quite significantly. So I give those as the examples. Neither one is better than the other. They're just different.
Right.
And if I had it to do over again, I probably would have reevaluated my work cadence more times over the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Instead of these two big major chunks.
That's really interesting. And that kind of goes into what's sort of expected of an entrepreneur if it's 20-hour days and whatnot. So it's a nice sort of lead into the topic of expectations. And we're both really type A people. I think most entrepreneurs are, and we all want to change the world. And sometimes it doesn't really feel like we're getting there fast enough, ever, really. And you talk a lot about how you're really intrinsically motivated, and I think that will ring true to a lot of entrepreneurs. So how do you kind of set your own expectations and goals?
I think it's just part of the notion of radical self-inquiry that I mentioned earlier, and knowing yourself. And I'm going to give two spectrums that I think are really important in the context of what your own goals are. One is this intrinsic to extrinsic motivation spectrum, and the other is introvert to extrovert spectrum. The intrinsic to extrinsic spectrum is that extrinsically motivated people are motivated by praise, acknowledgement, reward, sort of external validation. Right. Whereas if you're at the intrinsically motivated sense of the spectrum, you're motivated by things. Thanks. You're motivated by things that are internal. You're motivated by learning. You're motivated by discovery. You're motivated by whatever is the thing that is driving you intrinsically versus externally. Now, most people have both, right? You're not a savant and you're only intrinsically motivated or you're only extrinsically motivated. But you live on a spectrum, and I think understanding where you are on that spectrum is super important. An example would be, I'm very far on the intrinsically motivated end of the spectrum. For a long time, I didn't understand that when somebody was giving me an award or an organization was giving me an award for accomplishing something, it didn't mean anything to me. It didn't help. It didn't give me anything because I wasn't extrinsically motivated. It was kind of an annoyance. It was another obligation, another thing I had to do. But I didn't realize that a lot of those organizations were giving me that for them, right? That's why they existed. And for them, or for the people that were acknowledging me, they were extrinsically motivated. And so it was hard for them to understand that it wasn't something that motivated me. They viewed it as something that was powerful. And as a result, I wasn't particularly gracious. I wasn't a jerk about it, but I wasn't very gracious about being on the receiving end because I didn't understand the dynamic. And so I learned that. Now I'm pretty gracious when that sort of stuff happens because I realize that a lot of people, it's for them, not for me. The same thing on the introvert-extrovert spectrum. And I think a lot of people don't really understand the difference because many successful CEOs and many successful entrepreneurs are pretty deep introverts.
Yeah, we just pretend we're extroverts.
Well, you function effectively as an extrovert.
Yeah.
I'm an extremely deep introvert that functions very well in an extrovert world. The simplest way to think about it is just think about it as a big bottle of water. And if you're an introvert, spending time alone fills up the bottle of water.
Yeah.
If you're doing things that involve lots of other people, extroverted activity, going to parties, going to events, networking, being up till 2 o'clock in the morning with a bunch of friends hanging out, that drains your tank of water. If you're an extrovert, it's the opposite. The worst thing in the world to you is being home alone on a Friday night.
Yeah.
For me, like being home alone on a Friday night is just fucking awesome.
Yeah.
Right? And for that extrovert, like being surrounded by lots of other people fills up the tank. Again, people aren't savants. They get energy from both. But if you line these two things up as an entrepreneur, are you an introvert or extrovert? Are you intrinsically motivated or extrinsically motivated? Starting to think about that will have a lot to do with what drives you. Are you being driven because you're trying to solve a problem that you're obsessed about?
Yeah.
Or are you being driven because you want people to say what a great entrepreneur you are? Are you being driven because every time you get to spend time with people that are interested in what you're doing, it gives you energy? Or are you driven because you want to have some outcome that allows you to then do something else?
Yeah.
There's no judgment. There's no good or bad. It's knowing yourself and then trying to organize your life so you're able to do those things.
Yeah, and I read a bunch of your blog posts, but one of them being kind of one of the first ones where you talked about you were at, I think, CES, and you decided to take it easy one night. And so I recently went to my first web summit in Dublin, and I was only going to be there for 3 days, so I knew I wasn't going to really get to explore Dublin. And I'd gone 2 days really hard, probably met like 80 people that were really valuable, and I had set up meetings sort of all throughout those 2 days. And by the third day, because I'm an introvert who kind of plays the role as an extrovert, I was really drained. And I was also like, wow, I flew all the way to Dublin. I was staying at this beautiful resort outside of the city that had acres and acres of land. I'm like, this is ridiculous that I'm just going to get back onto my plane. And like, I already have so many people, there's no way I can follow up with everyone anyways. So what if I take today and like half of it, I relax, I see outdoors, the other half I follow up with everyone. And I think that was really one of my first big conscious decisions where there was actually like a value, like, okay, I spent this amount of money going to Dublin. It's a 3-day thing. I'm only taking 2 days of the value out of it, but I actually think, and I made that really conscious decision. And I think that's a really important thing for entrepreneurs to understand.
I think it's an awesome example. And you said something, and I'll challenge you to make it more positive than you said. You said you got 2 days of value out of it. I think you got 3 days of value out of it.
You're right.
And I think you got more value out of it than you would have gotten if you'd spent the last day meeting with a bunch of people. Because there's no rule that says to be a successful entrepreneur, you can't nourish your soul.
Yeah.
To be a successful entrepreneur, you must spend every minute of every opportunity trying to extract value from other people to justify the time you're spending on things. To be a successful entrepreneur, you have to have lots of energy to think. You have to have lots of energy to engage. You have to be creative. You have to take care of yourself. And as a human, you said it really well. You go to Dublin for 3 days and you fly home and you don't see anything. You don't actually get any sense of the place.
Yeah.
What a wasted opportunity as a human. And, labeling oneself as an entrepreneur, but taking the human out of it's a huge mistake. Now, the flip side of it's equally true. Like you go to Dublin and you just play for 3 days and you don't engage in the conference that you go. Don't sign up for the conference. Go to Dublin for a vacation, right? So it's trying to understand in the landscape and context of what you're doing, how to do it in a way that is sustaining and rewarding for you, and your personality. Last example, somebody who's an extreme extrovert who went to Dublin by themselves, that third day by themselves would have been a nightmare. Yeah. So for that person, spending 3 days in meetings and parties and staying up late and running around and doing every single event, that's going to nourish their soul. So try to make it personal. This is the advice to everybody that's young. Make it personal. Make it your own. And keep exploring yourself versus saying, well, this is how this type of entrepreneur was successful, therefore I must emulate that behavior. No, understand what they did.
Right.
And then pick the pieces that work for you.
Yeah. And so as a VC, you kind of have all these different stakeholders who also have tons of expectations of you, whether it's getting a great return on your fund, your portfolio founders getting sort of your support and advice and help, as well as kind of your other partners and your teammates. How do you go about kind of aligning all of the expectations from different stakeholders and then really doing that sort of self-valuing of which voices you hear a little bit heavier when there are points where you have to decide between them?
Yeah, it's actually quite simple. So the job part of what I do as a VC is very straightforward. We have investors who give us a box of money, and our job is to give them back a bigger box full of more money. Right. That's it. How we do that, as long as it's legal, is fine. So that's what their expectations of us are. And my partners and I have come up with a very simple outcome goal. And we have different strategies to accomplish that. But our interaction with our investors, our goal has been to be simple, forthright, and clear. Yeah. So we're just, this is what's going on. Here's the data, and here's what we think about it, versus any sort of other game playing to try to make things look different or better or whatever than they are. Right. So that's easy. And then as part of that, we've tried to develop across all of the constituencies that you described, investors, my partners, and our the founders that we work with, a deep personal relationship. It doesn't work with everybody, but we try to have an emotionally available, honest relationship rather than a one-up, one-down relationship or a distant relationship. With my partners, I have 4 partners. Our view of the world is simple. We have 2 things that we try to do. One is we're best friends. Yeah. So the personal relationship side of it is that we are each other's best friends, period. The second part of that is that we tell the truth. We like to say it's brutal honesty delivered kindly. So you know the notion of brutal honesty, like just this is the way it is. This is what I think. This is my truth. It may not be the truth, but it's my truth. This is what I believe, but done in a way that's kind. And so we built a culture where you can be wrong. You can express your opinion. Your ideas can be stupid. You can make mistakes. You can disappoint. You can have arguments. It's done in a way where you're still best friends. And it's sometimes emotional, but it's not emotional that's irrationally emotional. And when it's emotional, you can go deeper into the emotion. So that's the kind of relationship we've developed, and it's one that evolves and grows, and we learn constantly from each other. And then for founders and for CEOs, we have a really simple view of how we engage. Our job is to help the CEO of the company be successful. As long as we support the CEO of the company, we work for the CEO. Yeah. That's it. If we don't support the CEO at some point, it's our job to do something about it, which does not necessarily mean fire the CEO. Right. It means address the issue. It means talk openly with the CEO, talk openly with founders, other investors, and try to get back to a good place where you support the CEO. And ultimately, if you can't, take action. And the two actions to take are to disengage from the company or to replace the CEO.
Right.
But we try to keep it very simple. And then again, this whole spectrum of developing deep personal relationships that are brutally honest, delivered kindly, clear, minimal game playing. And, our job is to help. And if you don't need our help, no sweat. We got lots of other things to do.
Yeah, that's very true. And was there ever a time where you felt maybe it wasn't a major catastrophic failure, but you kind of failed to meet one of those stakeholders'
Constantly. Oh, no,
expectations?
we screw that up all the time. So I would separate from an aspirational goal from reality as a human being. As a human beings, we fuck up constantly against our aspirational goals. The power is when you realize that you're doing something against the value system you've defined, is to identify it, to own it, and to change, learn, and change. I'll use an example from my partners and I. We've had plenty of things where several of us noticed behavior of someone else of one of the other partners that was unhappy or uncomfortable. I'll use an example for me. We just added a fifth partner, a guy named Lyndall, who joined us. So I'm going to talk about my other partners, Seth, Ryan, and Jason, who we've been working together now since almost 2000. We had a meeting, and the three of them were angry at me, and I couldn't figure out. We have a quarterly or a monthly meeting that we review stuff. We have a quarterly meeting where about half the meeting is review of our portfolio, and half the meeting is all about us and how we're doing as individuals and what a relationship is. It's not just our relationship, but also what else is going on in our lives. And it was clear that the three of them were angry and unhappy with me. And I couldn't understand why. And we started talking, and as we unwound it, one of them finally blurted out, "It's because you're too famous." And my response was, "What the fuck are you talking about? Like, the goal shouldn't be for me to be too famous. The goal should be for more of us to be more famous." So help me understand what too famous means. One level down from that, there was deep insight. I can't remember who said it, but somebody said, a lot of the stuff that gets written about you talks about you. A lot of the stuff you're writing says I. It refers to Brad Feld. It's not talking about we or Foundry Group. And I hadn't really processed that, but they were absolutely correct. And it wasn't conscious on my part that I was writing my blog posts in first person. It wasn't conscious in my part when I was doing an interview that I wasn't reiterating Foundry Group and reiterating we when I was responding to somebody. And we call it, in hindsight, the I-we problem. Mm-hmm. And literally the change was I just started saying we. And I started writing everything in third person. Not everything. When it was my opinion, expressing my opinion about something, I would say I. But when it was us, it was we. Mm-hmm. And I also very consciously started moving many of the things that were coming at me from an interview perspective to the three of them, to the extent that they wanted it.
Yeah.
And it changed the dynamic. It could have been a very easy path for us to go down where they would have gotten more and more frustrated. There would have been more and more separation. We could have never confronted it. But this notion of brutal honesty, like whoever said it was in their head, you're too famous. I could have gotten upset. I could have reacted, whatever. It didn't make sense. Like, I got their reality, but that wasn't the problem. What's the problem?
Right.
Discovering the problem and continuing to work till you get to what you believe is root cause. It's very powerful. But stuff like that happens all the time. Yeah. And that's just part of, life.
Yeah, and I think the I versus we problem happens in a lot of co-founders I've seen. It's happened with myself and my co-founder Pocket of SoGal Ventures, because we both have the fund and then we have some other stuff that we both do on the side, writing, speaking, all different things. And I think it is something really important to address.
Yeah, and
as the CEO or founder, and make sure that the other people who are with you on the journey feel like it's a we journey, in your head at least.
Very powerful. And it's something that you can learn observing other people, how they talk. When somebody says, my team is the most important thing in the world to me, I built this great team and then everything is I. Or if you're in a meeting with you bring a few people from your team, but the CEO continues to talk over, interrupt the other people on the team versus give them the ability to talk about what's important to them, there's a lot of information in that. And so for the founders and CEOs, think about what kind of signal and tone you want to set and then reinforce it. And by the way, there are leaders who are very successful being I-focused leaders versus we-focused leaders. But are you one of those, and is that satisfying to you? This comes back to there's no right answer, there's your answer.
Yeah. I had a really tough experience in business school where I was working on a project with a bunch of people. We won some business plan competitions, and we had our final presentation to the class. I thought it went great in my head. Afterwards, they take me into a room and they just start screaming at me about how they feel like instead of co-founders, they were my assistants. And that,
Yep.
I was just the head of the show. I interrupted them. I wouldn't let them talk. And it was okay when we were doing it for the business plan competition because we won, but this was for a grade in a class where all of their grades depended on it just as much as mine. And that was the first time where people had kind of given me feedback before, but I hadn't had that oh my gosh, I just hit the bottom of it. And the business didn't end up working out, and that was probably the main reason. That was the main reason why. I was the problem, not the business. And I think especially for young entrepreneurs who it's their first venture, they may only be 18, 19, 20. It's a really important thing to think about because anyone who's working for free for 80 hours a week is invested in a company, whether it's the CEO or the CTO or whatever they put the title label on it.
Yep, totally agree.
Yeah.
Powerful insight.
Yeah. So on sort of that, a lot of entrepreneurs don't feel like they can really speak up about their mental health issues, and you've written about that, and they really don't feel like they can talk about it to investors. Maybe if they're honest, they won't be able to raise a round, or they may even be replaced as CEO and kind of lose the company that they built. What are your thoughts on entrepreneurs kind of being transparent about what's going on in their head?
I think that it's a very personal decision about how transparent you want to be about what's going on in your head. Part of what I've tried to do by being open is destigmatize mental health and mental health issues. I think mental health issues are no different in a lot of ways than many other health issues. If a founder or CEO has diabetes, that's fine, right? And a board and investors are probably aware enough about diabetes at this point and how treatable diabetes is and the dynamics around it. And mental health has very similar characteristics, not to the specific disease state, but to the ability to manage it and to deal with it. Right. So I tend to think about it as a very personal decision on one side for the entrepreneur, and on the other side, it's important for the entrepreneur to recognize that people handle mental health issues in a wide variety of ways. Some people can deal with it. Some people are afraid of it. Some people are struggling with their own issues. Some people view it as stigmatized and weakness. Some people view it as strength, to be aware of what you're struggling with. Some people have dealt with their own issues unsuccessfully or are afraid when other people bring their issues up because they have their own issues, or a family member has an issue, or you have a bias because you've only dealt with depression or anxiety a certain way, and so you think that it works a certain way. Or in some cases, there are plenty of people, in our world, in the world, who, they just believe you have to be strong, you have to get through it. Like whatever their mental model is, as a founder, it's important to do two things. One is know the mental model of the people you're working with, which would include your co-founders, people on your team, your investors. It's one thing to say, here's how I'm going to be. If you are willing to be that way, independent of whatever the side effects are or the second order effects are, that's fine. If you are concerned about the second order effects, understand what people around you are like. Yeah. And then be thoughtful about how you interact with people. So my advice for a lot of founders is you'll typically have one investor or somebody that's close to you as a mentor who is accessible on this dimension.
Right.
And it's pretty easy to figure out who that person is often because they've been open about it or they've been accessible about it. And if you don't know anyone, there's now enough people that have been public about it on the web. And some of it's facilitated by, the work that Jerry Colonna and Reboot have done, me talking about it, Rand Fishkin talking about it. All of a sudden, there's a lot of other founders who have talked openly about their own struggles with depression. If somebody's seeing this and they don't know they're struggling with depression and they don't know who to talk to, brad@feld.com, send me a note. Start a conversation with someone that is confidential and trusting, not with the goal of them fixing you, because I can't fix anybody. That's not my goal. My goal is to give a little relief so that you can at least talk about what you're struggling with and then give some suggestions for where you can get some real help. I'm a huge proponent, for example, of if you're really struggling with depression or other mental health issues that are inhibiting your own ability to function, or you feel like they're inhibiting your ability to function, I'm a big believer in psychiatry and psychology. I'm also a huge believer in professional coaching for people that are struggling with mental health issues, or even more importantly, struggling with their own identity in the context of being a founder or a leader. Oh, by the way, I'm also a big believer in coaches for very confident leaders, because many of those very confident leaders could be even better leaders if they worked with a coach. I'm also, as evidenced through TechStars, an enormous believer in mentorship. And the mentorship dynamic around mental health is one where you start to develop a long-term relationship with another entrepreneur who's a peer, or who can behave in a peer-like way with you, that's gone on their own journey through this. So I don't think the answer is ever simple.
Yeah.
It's certainly not be open, especially in today's environment still, where there's a lot of stigma around it. It might be for you, as an individual, not you necessarily, but as the individual entrepreneur, that might be the answer. But there's a range. And I think as an entrepreneur, the key thing is don't keep it inside. Like, even if your first step is to find a confidential relationship with a psychologist or a psychiatrist that you can go spend time with, do that. Even if it's a friend who is not part of your business and not an entrepreneur who you can have a confidential, trusted discussion with that can give you some empathy and allow you to talk, a family member, a significant other, or someone you don't have a particularly close relationship with, but because of what they've done publicly or how they presented themselves, how you can address it. The last comment I'd make, you had mentioned, and there's landscape around this, context around this of serious mental health issues that have come up in entrepreneurship in the last couple of years. Part of the reason why this has become much more of a topic is because of some high-profile founders who committed suicide. I think that it's a very, very scary thing to be depressed. It's even scarier when you're depressed and you don't know the way out. And on top of it, you have all of this pressure to be successful. The very first thing you should do when you find yourself in that state is get help. And if you find yourself at the far end of the spectrum, if you find yourself having suicidal ideations, call the National Suicide Hotline, which the phone number is on the web if you type National Suicide Hotline, and get immediate help. Because what happens is that the build of depression, as you feel trapped, if you don't start to take action against it in a constructive way, the trappedness feels worse. And it starts to accelerate in a way where there's hopelessness, and it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to kind of know that you're never alone, and that being depressed isn't just scary, but being an entrepreneur is kind of scary too.
The whole thing's scary. Look, being a human being is often scary. So, and in life, you can look at somebody and say, well, it's easy for him to say he's been successful, sure, but there's plenty of things in my world that are broken and fucked up and a mess. And, there are long stretches of time where the pressure was immense and I was unhappy or unclear. And oh, by the way, I have no expectation that the path forward is devoid of those things, right? You have to deal with stuff continually. I have a very, very close friend who's very successful entrepreneur, very emotionally strong, robust person whose father just died. And it's incredibly hard for him, that he has to navigate a life change like that. Well, the good news is he can navigate a life change with that with his friends rather than having to do it by himself.
Yeah. And from everything I've read, like your relationship with Amy, that's really been kind of the source of your strength. She's really kind of your partner in crime and has shared your whole journey. For entrepreneurs that are kind of just starting out, especially for ones that feel like maybe they haven't yet achieved that societal sort of stereotypical threshold of success, friends and family can often be some of the most harsh critics, as well as sort of hurtful when you're really kind of looking to them for support. Because as an entrepreneur, you hear no 100 times more than you hear yes. So how have you ever really had to kind of overcome that negative criticism and sort of disbelief from your family and friends when you're sort of building who you are today?
Yeah, many, many times in lots of different ways. And I'd separate family from significant other because I think the dynamics with parents is different because of the parent-child relationship, and there's a whole set of things around that of both aspirational goals and success and satisfying or disappointing and how that plays out. With significant other, when I think about my relationship with Amy, we have a couple of things that I think are foundational. One is that we're each other's biggest fan. I'm her biggest fan, she's my biggest fan. This doesn't mean that we're not critical of the other person, that we don't get angry at the other person, that the other person doesn't disappoint. But at the core, we're each other's biggest fans. And I think a relationship, especially with an entrepreneur, that's an important value. Because if you're not each other's biggest fans, the feedback that's negative, the constructive criticism, is taken in a negative way versus a thoughtful way. And you get into this very uncomfortable situation where it's just another person who's telling you can't do something, which is already, as an entrepreneur, incredibly hard, and you have to break through that. Now, it's not that your partner needs to say, you can do it, you can do anything you want and have, nothing but, positive commentary. But there's, being each other's fan is, I'm there for you. Like, I know you want to do this. I support you trying to do this. Here's why I think it's going to be harder. Here's what I see that's a struggle. Here's some feedback. That's super useful. But you shouldn't be doing this. This isn't what you should be spending your life on. That's a harder one, and that's a deeper conversation between partners where you have to start saying, hey, look, I'm your biggest fan. Why aren't you my biggest fan? So that's a piece. A second is this thing I said earlier, and I think it's especially true for the founder. Part of the reason why a partner of an entrepreneur or founder starts to have a lot of negative feelings is this words not matching your action. So, you're working 80 hours, 100 hours a week, you're obsessed and focused on your business. You still can and should make time for your partner. And defining what that time looks like in advance sometimes, setting appropriate expectations is important. But then following through on them is equally or more important. So, if I say to Amy, hey, look, I'm on the road a lot in January, February, and March because of a new fund that we're raising. Now, she doesn't like that. But we talked about it. I set the expectation, and she's fine with it. But I set the expectation in the context of when I'm with her on the weekends, when we're not traveling, I'm really with her. And that doesn't mean that all weekend I'm really with her, but that my attention is with her. And it turns out that some of the weekends, because of the travel rhythm, it's not worth it for me to come back home for a day to just fly out again. And that's okay, because we could talk about that and set the expectation. It's so important. She said, while you're on the road, what's critically important to me is every day we spend at least 15 minutes on FaceTime. So every day we're going to have a 15-minute phone. We always talk on the phone anyway, but just a 15-minute face-to-face before bed, first thing in the morning. And my goal is going to be to do first thing in the morning and before bed every day. If we have a day that goes by where that doesn't happen, that's my fail, not her fail. right? So it's set the expectation, but then follow through on that. And then the last comment I'd make in this is one of the things that played out a lot in our life early on our relationship early on that I didn't realize is that the founder often, you're the center of the universe all day long in terms of the work you're doing. Everything's coming at you. You're making decisions. You're fixing things. You're doing stuff. You're the center of the universe. When I came home, I was still the center of the universe. A simple move for the founder that changes the dynamic of the relationship is let your partner be the center of the universe. It's not that you're being one down to your partner, but just get out of the headset of being the center of the universe.
Yeah.
And it's actually 30 years later, it's a massive relief. I come home and I don't have to fix or solve anything. And like we're together, I don't have to fix what Amy wants to do. And we're together having a together time, not a time that's about what's going on in my world. And often she says, what's going on in your world? Tell me about your day, then we can talk about it. Yeah. But I'm consciously aware that we're talking about our days, not that I just showed up with this persona of, the world revolves around me. Last thing I would give that's not about a relationship, and I give this to every TechStars founder that's going through TechStars, which is this intense 90-day period, you will have very intense stretches of time with your business where like it's all you're doing. You have to give yourself periodic breaks. And if you have a significant other, that significant other is a great person to spend those breaks with. But you also have to do something for yourself every day, not with your partner, but for yourself. If you like, this is what I tell the TechStars people, if you like ice cream, go have an ice cream cone every day. Walk to a different ice cream. You're in TechStars, New York. There's lots of different places to get ice cream in New York. Every day, walk to a different place, try a different flavor. If you like yoga, do yoga every day. If you like to exercise, that's an easy one. If you like to read, take a book or get your Kindle and sit for 30 minutes every day and read a chapter or two of a book, just quietly in the corner of your office. If it's nice outside, go sit at a bench in a park. Do it, in bed before you get up. Find something that you like to do for yourself and nurture yourself every day. And if you're in a relationship, make sure you're doing that in the relationship too. And it's amazing. Amy and I have a thing we call 4 minutes in the morning. And this is why the FaceTime is so easy to do first thing in the morning. When one or the other of us wakes up, the very first thing we do is we spend 4 minutes together. And really nice. Oftentimes, if I wake up first, I hang out with her while she makes her coffee. If she wakes up first, she hangs out with me while I make my coffee. But you stop what you're doing and just go hang out with the other person for a few minutes. Yeah. And just say good morning. And then you go off to what you do versus so many couples, you wake up and you're immediately checking mail and texting things and getting ready and whatever. So think through those rhythms and try to build some of them into your life as a founder. I think that's broadly helpful for all founders.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Brad. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I'll definitely put up the links for Reboot.io as well as your book, Startup Life, which I highly recommend to everyone.
Thanks.
So thank you.
Go forth and conquer. And if I can be helpful, reach out anytime.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much.
Okay. Take care.